he paid just $12 for an abandoned Christmas cabin that locals swore was cursed. But when the single father pried open the ancient chest hidden beneath the floorboards, what he found inside wasn't just worth $150 million. It was a secret that powerful people had buried for 30 years, and they would do anything to keep it hidden. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The snow fell thick and silent over Cedar Falls, Montana that December morning, blanketing everything in white like a reset button nobody pressed. Marcus Bennett sat in his 15-year-old Toyota Camry outside the county courthouse, engine idling to keep the warmth alive, staring at a wrinkled piece of paper in his lap. The notice was straightforward. Typed in sterile government font, estate auction, former Holiday Haven property. Minimum bid $12. $12. That was less than what he dropped on groceries the day before, making chicken and pasta stretch through the week. Less than the copay for his daughter Zara's recent checkup, less than the overdue charge on his water bill. Marcus was 32, but felt decades older. Single fatherhood had a way of wearing you down in invisible places. Behind the eyes, across the shoulders, in how you learn to save hope like spare change. He juggled 2 jobs. Early shift at the truck stop diner on Route 29, where drivers left tips in coins and worn bills, and late inventory at the tool shop, where the overhead lights buzzed like angry wasps. Between those shifts, he was a father to 7-year-old Zara, who still trusted in wonder despite a world that had tested them at every turn. The auction kicked off at 10 o'clock. Marcus glanced at his phone. 9:43. He had 17 minutes to figure out if he was actually going through with this. Bidding on a property everyone in town labeled cursed. A spot where teenagers challenged each other to get close on Halloween night. A structure that had been vacant for 3 decades. Windows pitch black, roof drooping, ringed by corroded Christmas decorations that hadn't gleamed since 1994. He'd passed it countless times. Everyone had. It stood at the town's boundary where the evergreens grew dense and pavement gave way to dirt. A massive log structure with a tilted sign still dangling above the entrance. Bernard's Holiday Haven. Magic every season. Except Magic had abandoned that place long ago. Marcus pushed open his car door, frigid air rushing in like a warning. He climbed out into ankle-deep powder, his boots patched with duct tape at the bottom, making that satisfying crunch as he headed toward the courthouse entrance. Other folks were trickling in, mainly nosy townspeople. A handful of out-of-town investors wearing pristine jackets and shiny footwear. Nobody seemed especially drawn to an old Christmas cabin. They were after the land deals, the business properties, the sensible opportunities. Inside the auction room carried the scent of aged timber and lukewarm coffee, metal chairs arranged in orderly lines. A man in a charcoal suit stood up front, organizing documents. Marcus found a seat toward the rear, hands buried in his coat pockets, his fingers touching the $12 he'd brought, one $10 note and 2 wrinkled singles. That was everything. That was all he could gamble. Zara had no idea he was here. Marcus had sent her off to school that morning with a kiss on the forehead and a promise he'd show up for dismissal. He didn't bring up the auction, didn't share the wild thought that had stolen his sleep. What if he could secure a place? An actual place, not the tight apartment over the coin laundry where the walls were paper thin and you heard every dispute, every infant's tears, every existence unraveling in surround sound. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Welcome, everyone. We've got 14 properties lined up today. Let's begin. He powered through the opening lots rapidly. An empty plot near the elementary school, a repossessed townhouse on Oak Avenue, a retail space in the downtown district. The bids fired off quickly. Investors lifted their cards. Prices soared. Marcus observed, shrinking with each property that passed. Then he reached item number 7. And now we have the former Bernard's Holiday Haven property. 7.3 acres. Main structure approximately 3,200 square feet, built in 1958. No recent inspections. Sold as is. The auctioneer paused, organized his documents. Minimum bid $12. The room fell silent. Someone up front chuckled. Marcus caught murmurs from behind. That place is a wreck. Roof's probably collapsed already. I heard somebody died there. Nobody sane would go near it. The auctioneer waited. Anyone? $12 to open. Marcus's heart pounded against his chest. His hand felt impossibly heavy as he gradually lifted it. The room shifted, faces turned, attention fixed on him. The man in the taped-up boots. The truck stop server. The one who scraped pennies together. The auctioneer paused. We have $12. Any other bids? Silence. Stretched thin and awkward. Marcus held his breath. His hand shook in the air. Going once, going twice. The gavel dropped with a crack that rang like a gunshot. Sold to bidder 83 for $12. Marcus sat motionless, struggling to grasp what had just transpired. He'd purchased a property, 7 acres, a structure, for what a bargain meal cost. After the auction, Marcus walked to the clerk's desk in a fog. He scribbled his name on papers he barely absorbed, his hand trembling so violently the signatures looked like kindergarten attempts. The clerk, a stocky woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, pushed a manila folder across the counter. Keys, deed, and a land survey. The woman shifted closer, voice lowering to barely audible. You certain about this, sir? That place carries a reputation. Marcus cleared his throat. What kind of reputation? The woman scanned the room, then lifted her shoulders. Just rumors. Old man Bernard operated that holiday shop for years. Then one day, back in '94, he locked the doors and vanished. Some people say he lost his mind. Others claim he discovered something dangerous. Whatever happened, nobody's stepped inside since. Marcus grabbed the folder and tucked it beneath his arm. Well, I guess I'm about to change that. The drive out to the property lasted 20 minutes. The road thinned as he left town behind, evergreens crowding both sides, their limbs sagging with fresh powder. Marcus's hands clamped the steering wheel so firmly his knuckles turned pale. What had he just committed to? He'd gambled food money on a long shot, on a structure that might be rubble. On a hope so delicate it could crumble with reality. But something drew him onward. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the expression on Zara's face last week when she'd asked if holiday magic was real and Marcus had to stretch the truth while knowing he couldn't manage a single gift. Maybe it was pure exhaustion with barely surviving and the reckless belief that somewhere, somehow, life could offer more than scraping by. He veered onto the dirt road and there it stood. Bernard's holiday haven emerged from the snow like a relic from forgotten times. The central building was bigger than he'd imagined. A sprawling log construction with a sharp-angled roof and a generous front deck. Snow had piled against the walls. Icicles dangled from the edges like crystallized grief. The weathered sign swung in the breeze, squeaking on corroded chains. Marcus pulled up and climbed out. The quiet was total. No wildlife, no engines, just wind through the evergreens and the gentle hush of descending snow. He approached the entrance, boots plunging deep, his breath creating vapor clouds in the bitter cold. The deck planks moaned beneath his weight. Rot, most likely. The entrance was enormous, etched with worn holiday imagery, reindeer, stars, kids unwrapping packages. He sorted through the key ring from the folder. 3 keys. The first one entered the lock. It twisted with a metallic groan, and the door pushed inward. Blackness. The odor reached him first, stale and frozen, like a sealed crypt from generations past. Marcus grabbed his phone, activated the flashlight. The beam pierced the shadows, revealing a cavernous space that had been a shop. Shelving covered the walls, still loaded with grimy toys and ornaments. A lengthy counter stretched across the rear. Holiday lights dangled from above, dark and snarled. Everything was suspended in time, as if Bernard had simply stepped out one afternoon and never came back. Marcus entered, the floor groaning beneath him. Dust particles floated in the air, disturbed by his presence. He swept the light around the space, absorbing it all. Display cases still contained ornaments. A faded holiday costume hung on a coat stand near the cash register. A crafting area in the corner had tools spread across tables, unfinished toys collecting grime. It was haunting and captivating and melancholy all at once. He could almost sense the ghost of children's joy, the chime of bells, the comfort of holidays gone by. But now it was just hollow, deserted, erased from memory. He ventured deeper into the building. A doorway opened to what appeared to be living space, a compact kitchen with 70s-style fixtures, a bedroom with a carefully arranged bed, blankets buried in dust, a bathroom with fractured tile work. Bernard had resided here above his store, isolated with his holiday ambitions. Marcus explored every area, his logical brain already tallying expenses. New roof, wiring updates, pipe work, code compliance. The catalogue became daunting. This wasn't just a renovation project. This was a catastrophe dressed up in sentiment. He was preparing to exit, to retreat back to his vehicle and face facts, when he spotted something unusual in the rear corner of the crafting section beneath a work table buried under vintage equipment. The floorboards appeared distinct, fresher, or more accurately, intentionally arranged. He crouched down, clearing away years of wood shavings and dirt. The boards created a square layout. A gap traced along the borders, nearly invisible. His fingers discovered a shallow notch. He tugged. Nothing budged. He attempted again, applying more force this time. The boards rose with a protest, exposing darkness underneath. A cellar or storage cavity. The scent that emerged was distinct, more arid, more preserved, like someone had protected this area deliberately. Marcus's pulse quickened. He directed his phone light down through the gap. Stone stairs led into shadows. He could distinguish rough stone walls, a packed earth floor, and at the heart of the space, something substantial and box-shaped draped with heavy cloth. Every nerve warned him to seal the opening and retreat. Nothing positive came from concealed spaces in deserted structures. But curiosity, that risky partner of desperate faith, urged him onward. He lowered himself through the gap, feet locating the stone stairs. They were firm, professionally constructed. He descended cautiously, one careful step after another, into the frozen darkness beneath. The cellar was compact, perhaps 10 feet by 12. The ceiling hung low enough that Marcus had to bend slightly. His light traveled across the area. The walls featured shelving holding glass jars packed with rusty nails and fasteners. A few deteriorating boxes occupied one corner, their markings faded past recognition, but it was the item in the middle that captured his focus. He moved toward it slowly, almost ceremonially. The covering was thick canvas, industrial strength, fastened with rope that had turned fragile through the years. He loosened the knots with unsteady fingers and removed the draping. Dust burst into the atmosphere, triggering coughs and forcing him backward. When it settled, he stared in amazement. A trunk, not just any trunk, but something that appeared museum-worthy. It was enormous, roughly 4 feet long and 3 feet across, constructed of ebony wood, braced with iron strips. The metal had acquired a blue-green coating, but the construction was magnificent. Complex engravings blanketed every inch. Holiday trees, celestial bodies, winged figures, and text in an antique typeface he couldn't fully decipher in the weak light. The front featured a substantial lock, ancient and elaborate, the type you'd encounter in folklore. Marcus's breathing faltered. He extended his hand, his fingers quaking as they made contact with the timber. It was sleek, buffed, maintained. This wasn't just carpentry. This was a vault, an authentic one. He attempted to lift the lid, but the lock wouldn't yield. He applied more pressure, then hesitated, worried about causing harm. He walked around the trunk deliberately, studying every element. On the panel, carved into the timber, he discovered additional text. He leaned in, following the lettering with his fingertip. For those who pursue the essence of generosity, may this illuminate the shadows. Bernard Caldwell, December 24, 1993, 1993. 1 year before Bernard vanished, 1 year before the store went dark permanently, Marcus settled back, thoughts spinning. What was inside this trunk? Why was it concealed? Why had Bernard abandoned it here? He needed explanations. He needed to crack this open. But first, he needed to grab Zara from school. Reality slammed back. He glanced at his phone. 2:17, he'd been here for hours without tracking time. School dismissed at 3 o'clock. He had 43 minutes. Marcus climbed back up the stone stairs, his legs trembling from excitement and freezing temperatures. He secured the hatch carefully, ensuring the floorboards aligned perfectly. He cast one final glance around the workshop at the grimy toys and vanished aspirations, then made for the exit. Outside, the snow had ceased. The sun pierced through the overcast sky, throwing elongated shadows across the pristine terrain. He drove back to town in a haze. His thoughts a whirlwind of riddles and scenarios. What was inside that trunk? Cash, valuables, vintage holiday items, or something completely different? And why conceal it? Why seal it away in a hidden cellar beneath a store nobody would ever enter again? Zara was stationed outside the school when Marcus arrived, backpack bouncing as she sprinted to the vehicle. She jumped in with a rush of frosty air and youthful enthusiasm. "Dad, guess what? We're putting on a winter show. I'm going to be a snowflake." Marcus grinned, pulling himself back to the moment. "That's incredible, sweetheart. When's the performance?" December 21st. Zara fastened her seatbelt, still buzzing. "We get to wear outfits and everything. Can you help me make a costume, please?" "Absolutely, kiddo. We'll work it out." As they headed home through the fading winter light, Zara recounted her day, about classmates and lessons, and the anticipation of the holidays just 3 weeks out. Marcus listened, acknowledging at appropriate moments. But his thoughts kept returning to that trunk, to the cellar, to the puzzle he'd acquired for $12. That evening, after Zara was tucked in, Marcus sat at their cramped kitchen table with his laptop glowing. He entered Bernard Caldwell, Cedar Falls, Montana, into the search engine. The findings were limited. A handful of newspaper pieces from the 1980s about the holiday shop. A short death notice from 2008. Bernard had passed away in an assisted living facility in Billings. No relatives mentioned, no clarification for why he'd walked away from his passion. He pushed further, scrolling through archived newspaper databases. He located an article from the Cedar Falls Chronicle dated January 5, 1994. Local holiday store shuts down without warning. The story was brief. Bernard's holiday haven, a Cedar Falls landmark for 36 years, has shuttered without explanation. Owner Bernard Caldwell could not be contacted for statement. The property remains secured and residents report observing no movement since December 25, Christmas Day, the day following when Bernard dated that engraving on the trunk. Marcus reclined in his seat, fixated on the monitor. Something had occurred. Something major enough to make a person abandon his whole existence overnight. And whatever it was, it connected to that trunk. He needed to return there. Needed to access it. But he also needed equipment. A locksmith would raise concerns he couldn't address. He'd have to handle this alone. He shut his laptop and moved to the utility drawer in the kitchen, extracting the meager assortment of tools he possessed. A screwdriver, a hammer, a set of pliers. Not exactly a burglar's toolkit, but it would have to suffice. The following morning, Marcus phoned in sick to the truck stop. He despised the deception, despised leaving them understaffed, but this couldn't be delayed. He delivered Zara to school, assuring her he'd arrive on time for pickup, then headed directly back to the holiday haven. The property appeared transformed in sunlight, less sinister and more abandoned, like it had been anticipating decades for someone to care. Marcus collected his modest bag of tools and went inside. He moved straight to the rear, lifted the hatch, and descended into the cellar. The trunk remained exactly as he'd left it, silent and cryptic. He knelt alongside it, inspecting the lock thoroughly. It was aged but expertly crafted, solid iron with an internal system he couldn't observe. He attempted the screwdriver first, trying to leverage it open. The lock held firm. He switched to the hammer next, tapping carefully around the perimeter. Nothing budged. Irritation swelled in his chest. He leaned back, breathing heavily. There had to be an approach. He studied the trunk more meticulously, sliding his hands along the joints, the edges, the decorated surfaces. That's when he discovered it. On the rear right edge, concealed within the ornamental carvings, a tiny depression. He applied pressure. A subtle click resonated in the quiet cellar. Marcus's pulse jumped. He shifted to the front of the trunk and tested the lock once more. This time, it rotated smoothly in his grip. The components inside adjusted and disengaged. The lid rose with a groan that sounded like relief after decades of containment. Marcus opened the trunk completely, his hands quaking so violently he almost lost hold of his phone. He directed the light inward and stopped moving. His breathing halted. His heart seemed to pause. The trunk was packed full with items that captured the light and reflected it in endless patterns. Papers. Stacks of papers wrapped in protective cloth. Containers. Small timber containers arranged precisely. And something else. Something that made his eyes widen and his jaw drop. Bonds. Bearer bonds. Dozens of them. Perhaps hundreds. Each one labeled with figures he struggled to comprehend. 10,000, 25,000. 50,000, Marcus reached in with unsteady fingers and extracted one of the paper stacks. He unwrapped it delicately. Inside were documents, aged and discolored but maintained flawlessly. Stock certificates, investment records, all dated from the 1980s and early 90s, all carrying Bernard Caldwell's signature. He opened one of the compact timber containers. Inside, cradled in velvet that had retained its richness, sat a coin, gold, substantial. He raised it to the light. It was an antique, struck in 1876, the centennial year. He opened another container, another coin, then another. Each one unique, each one obviously precious. But it was the bonds that made his hands tremble. He extracted the collection, tallying them with mounting astonishment. 47 bearer bonds, each one valued anywhere from $10,000 to $100,000, unsigned, anonymous, legally cashable by whoever possessed them. Marcus's thoughts raced, attempting to estimate, even cautiously. This was millions, potentially tens of millions, and the coins, the certificates, the remaining contents he hadn't even assessed yet. He collapsed backward onto the frozen earth floor, chest rising and falling, struggling to absorb what lay before him. Why? Why would Bernard conceal this? Why would he abandon a fortune? What had transpired to make someone seal millions of dollars in a trunk and hide it beneath his establishment? He searched deeper into the trunk. At the absolute bottom, beneath everything else, he discovered an envelope. It was distinct from the others. Created from quality paper, sealed with wax. Across the surface, in refined penmanship, were 3 words for the children. Marcus cracked the seal with trembling fingers and withdrew a letter. The paper was substantial, premium. The handwriting matched the engraving on the trunk. He read it deliberately, his eyes moistening with emotion. To whoever discovers this, the letter opened. If you're reading these words, it means I did not live to complete what I began. My name is Bernard Caldwell, and for 36 years I operated a holiday shop in Cedar Falls, Montana. But that shop was never merely about distributing toys and decorations. It was about something greater. It was about providing hope to children who possess none. Marcus's hands quivered as he kept reading. The letter extended for 3 pages, and with each section, the reality emerged like a mystery he'd wandered into. Bernard hadn't simply been a merchant. He'd been a hidden benefactor, channeling his earnings to assist struggling households, to guarantee every child in Cedar Falls had something to unwrap. He'd accomplished it anonymously, privately, for decades. But in 1987, he'd received an unforeseen inheritance from a far-removed cousin, $150 million. Instead of spending it, he'd invested it strategically, safely, allowing it to compound while he maintained his discreet charitable efforts. By 1993, his holdings had expanded to over $300 million. He'd intended to create a foundation, a lasting trust that would support children in need indefinitely. But then something occurred. Marcus read the following section twice, struggling to accept it. In early December 1993, Bernard had been contacted by agents from a development corporation. They wanted his property, all 7 acres. They proposed $2 million. When he declined, they turned hostile. They suggested threats. They made it obvious they had influence, authority, methods of acquiring what they desired. Bernard had grown alarmed. He recognized his wealth made him vulnerable. He understood the foundation he'd planned to establish would attract notice, examination, potentially peril. So, he'd reached a conclusion. On December 24, 1993, he'd liquidated everything. He'd transformed his entire wealth into bearer bonds, scarce coins, and other movable assets. He'd locked them in this trunk with intentions to wait until circumstances calmed until he could determine how to advance safely. But on Christmas evening, men had arrived at his store. Bernard didn't identify who they were, but he made it evident they intended violence. He'd fled through a rear window, abandoning everything behind. He'd lived the remainder of his existence in concealment, taking basic jobs under false identities, never risking a return. He'd composed this letter years afterward in 2006 when he understood he was terminal. It was his ultimate admission, his final prayer, that somehow someday someone would locate this treasure and accomplish what he couldn't use it to support children. The letter concluded with guidance, thorough, precise guidance about how to process the bonds, how to create a trust, how to ensure the money reached where it was intended, and at the absolute end, one closing statement. Don't let them prevail. Don't let greed and terror overcome compassion and kindness. Give these children the holidays they deserve. Marcus sat in that frigid cellar, tears rolling down his face, clutching a letter from a deceased man who'd lived his remaining years aware his life's mission sat buried and abandoned. He gazed at the trunk, at the fortune contained within it, at the obligation that had just fallen into his hands, like a blessing and a burden intertwined. He'd arrived here seeking a new beginning. Instead, he'd uncovered something far larger, far more hazardous, and he had no clarity on what to do next. Marcus sat motionless on the earth floor of that cellar for what seemed like hours, but was likely only moments. Bernard's letter shook in his grasp, the words becoming indistinct as tears flowed down his face. He cleared them away firmly with his sleeve and looked back into the trunk. The fortune inside sparkled gently in the glow of his phone light. Each bearer bond and gold coin embodying not just wealth but a deceased man's vision, a commitment he'd never been capable of fulfilling. He cautiously extracted the collection of bonds, placing them aside on an untouched portion of top. Underneath them were additional layers. He located leather binders containing stock certificates from corporations he knew, IBM, General Electric, Coca-Cola. Each certificate represented shares acquired decades earlier, shares that had divided and increased through the years. He didn't possess enough knowledge about markets to determine their present value, but even his basic understanding indicated these were worth considerable sums. Further down, he uncovered containers of coins. Not merely the gold specimens he'd seen initially, but silver dollars from the 1800s, uncommon pennies, commemorative collections. Each container was marked in Bernard's meticulous handwriting with dates and concise descriptions. 1889 Morgan dollar pristine condition. 1913 Liberty Head nickel. 1955 double-die penny. Marcus had viewed enough late-evening television to recognize some of these coins were legendary among enthusiasts worth hundreds of thousands individually. But it was the intimate items that made his chest constrict. Secured into a lateral compartment, he located a photograph album wrapped in protective cloth. He opened it with careful respect, and Bernard's life emerged across the pages. Black and white photos from the 1950s showed a young man standing in front of a freshly built log cabin. A sign in his hands read, Bernard's Holiday Haven. His smile looked real, overflowing with hope and excitement. More photos followed. Bernard with children, dozens of them over the decades, sitting on Santa's lap, tearing open presents, their faces glowing with wonder. Bernard behind the shop counter, surrounded by toys and garlands, looking proud and peaceful. Bernard at town events, handing out candy canes, dressed as an elf, always slightly off to the side, always giving. But other photos cut deeper, tightening Marcus's throat. Newspaper clippings slid between the pages. Stories about families who'd received anonymous help during hard times. A single mother whose rent was mysteriously paid. A family whose house burned down, finding an envelope of cash in their mailbox. A sick child whose medical bills were covered by an unknown donor. Bernard had recorded every person he'd helped, every life he'd touched, all in secret, never asking for praise or credit. Marcus found another letter inside the album. This one was shorter, dated December 1st, 1993. It was addressed to someone named Lillian, and the voice felt different, more intimate, edged with fear. Lillian, if you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong. The men from Apex Development came to the shop again today. 3 of them this time. They weren't asking anymore. They were threatening. They know about the inheritance somehow. They know I have money. They want the land, but I think they want more than that now. They want everything. I'm frightened, Lillian. For the first time in my life, I'm truly afraid. I've moved the collection to a safe place. If anything happens to me, find the trunk. Make sure it goes where I intended. Make sure the children are taken care of. Please? Your brother. Bernard. Marcus's hands trembled as he laid the letter down. Bernard had a sister, Lillian. Someone who might still be alive, who might hold answers, who might help Marcus understand what he'd walked into. He combed through the remaining pages of the album but found no more letters to Lillian, no pictures of her, no hint of where she might have lived. At the very bottom of the trunk, under folds of velvet cloth, Marcus found one last object that stole his breath. A ledger, thick and leather-bound. Every page covered in Bernard's precise handwriting. He opened to the first sheet and read. Holiday Fund Ledger 1958 to 1993. Gifts given. Lives changed. He turned the pages slowly, skimming the entries. Each line listed a date, a family name or simple description, an amount, and a short note explaining why. December 1962, Walker family, $200. Father killed in logging accident. For children need boots, coats, and Christmas meal. March 1971, anonymous mother on Birch Lane, $500. Working nights. Son needs surgery. Too proud to ask for help. November 1989, Ramirez family, $1,000. Trailer fire destroyed belongings. Need help replacing essentials before first snow. The entries continued for hundreds of pages. Thousands of gifts. Tens of thousands of dollars quietly poured into the town over 35 years. And that was before the inheritance. Marcus reached a section labeled Special Fund 1988 to 1993. Here the amount soared. $10,000 here, $25,000 there. Full college tuitions, life-saving treatments, mortgage payments, seed money for small businesses run by struggling families. Bernard had been deliberately trying to raise an entire community out of poverty, one household at a time, all while living simply above his store, keeping almost nothing for himself. Marcus closed the ledger and leaned back, crushed by the enormity of what he'd uncovered. This wasn't just a stash of wealth. This was a mission, a mantle. Bernard Caldwell had poured his whole life into lifting others, and in the end, greed and intimidation had forced him into hiding. The treasure he'd spent decades building, the good he'd planned to unleash, had sat locked away in this cellar for 30 years while kids went without, parents struggled, and his dream lay buried in the dark. She glanced at her phone. 11:27, she'd been down here for nearly 3 hours. Zara was safe at school, wouldn't need pickup until 3 o'clock. But Marcus had obligations. He had a shift at the tool shop at 4 o'clock. He had debts stacking up. He had a life, however precarious, that demanded his focus. But how could he turn his back on this? How could he simply seal the trunk and act like he'd never opened it? Marcus reached a decision. He methodically started recording everything. He snapped photos of the bonds, the coins, the certificates, the letters, the ledger entries. He photographed every side of the trunk itself, the engraved messages, the concealed release mechanism. If something happened to him, if the trunk vanished, there would be evidence it had been real. He uploaded everything to cloud storage, then forwarded copies to his personal email. Protection. Then he started the careful work of extracting items from the trunk. He couldn't abandon everything here, not after discovering what it represented, what it was worth. He spotted a canvas duffel in the cellar corner, grimy but usable, and methodically packed the most critical items, the bonds, selected rare coins, the letters, the ledger, the photo album. The stock certificates he kept in their portfolios inside the trunk. They could be traced, tougher to transport, more secure here temporarily. The duffel felt substantial when he zipped it closed. Probably 30 pounds of history and purpose. He hoisted it over his shoulder and climbed back up the stone stairs. He secured the hatch with precision, ensuring the floorboards aligned perfectly, then draped the area with the dusty canvas he'd discovered. To anyone passing through, it would appear as nothing more than an old work table in a deserted building. Marcus walked through the workshop once more, perceiving it with fresh eyes. This hadn't simply been a retail space. It had been a command center for compassion, a place where one person had fought a silent battle against hardship and hopelessness. And now it belonged to him. The weight of it felt both overwhelming and exhilarating. He was halfway to the exit when he detected it. The grinding of tires on dirt. A vehicle approaching outside. Marcus stopped cold, pulse racing. Nobody was aware he was here. Nobody ventured out this direction. The property had sat empty for 3 decades. Who would arrive now? The morning after he'd acquired it? He shifted to the window and looked through the grimy glass. A black SUV idled in the clearing, motor humming, windows tinted opaque. As he observed, the driver's door swung open and a man emerged. He stood tall, perhaps 50, wearing a high-end overcoat and leather gloves. He gazed up at the holiday haven with an expression Marcus couldn't decipher. Curiosity, wariness, something sharper, more deliberate. A second man climbed out from the passenger side. Younger, stockier, with the kind of frame that screamed private security or enforcement. He surveyed the surroundings with tactical precision, the way professionals do when they're trained to identify danger. Marcus's throat tightened. He retreated from the window, gripping the canvas duffel harder. The first man advanced toward the deck. His footwear looked too polished, too refined. Urban shoes not built for snow and gravel. He mounted the steps with confidence and rapped on the door. 3 crisp knocks that reverberated through the hollow structure. Marcus didn't shift, didn't exhale. He stood 20 feet from the entrance with zero cover. The workshop sprawled as one vast open room. If the door opened, he'd be visible instantly. Another knock, more forceful. Hello? Anyone inside? We're trying to reach the new owner. The voice sounded refined, polished, the kind of voice accustomed to issuing commands and receiving compliance. Marcus's thoughts spiraled. Should he respond? Stay silent? Bolt? But there was only one way out and these men controlled it. His Camry sat right there in plain view. They knew someone was present. He made a split-second choice. He rapidly moved to the rear of the workshop, located a storage closet he'd spotted earlier, and crammed the canvas duffel inside behind a tower of decaying boxes. He draped it with a tattered blanket, then straightened himself, pulled in a deep breath, and approached the door. He cracked it open just enough to peer through. The man on the deck smiled, but the warmth never touched his gaze. Good morning. Apologies for the interruption. My name is Richard Kane. I represent Apex Development Corporation. He extracted a business card and extended it toward him. Marcus's blood went cold. Apex Development, the identical corporation that had intimidated Bernard, the same outfit that had forced him underground 30 years ago, and they were standing here less than 24 hours after he'd acquired the property. That couldn't be random chance. He accepted the card with a hand he struggled to keep controlled. What can I help you with? Kane's smile broadened marginally. We understand you acquired this property at auction yesterday. Quite unexpected, actually. We'd been tracking the sale, planning to bid ourselves, but we encountered delays in billings. Traffic, you understand how it goes. He laughed, a noise devoid of genuine humor. Regardless, we'd like to present you with an offer. Spare you the hassle of managing this aging structure. I just purchased it, Marcus said cautiously. I'm not interested in selling. Naturally, but listen to what we have to say. Kane motioned toward the structure behind him. This property needs extensive repairs. The roof alone likely requires $50,000 in work. The wiring is outdated, potentially hazardous. The plumbing, the foundation, everything. You're facing hundreds of thousands in restoration before you could even consider utilizing it for any purpose. That's assuming the entire building isn't declared unsafe. Marcus folded his arms. I understood what I was purchasing. Did you? Kane's demeanor changed subtly, turned more pointed. Did you know about the liens? The overdue property taxes, the environmental reviews mandated for commercial property in this district. Marcus's gut twisted. He'd scrawled his signature on documents in a rush yesterday. He hadn't examined everything thoroughly. Had he overlooked something? Was there financial liability tied to this place he hadn't caught? Kane registered his uncertainty and advanced. We're willing to offer you $50,000 cash today. You leave with a considerable return on your $12 purchase and we absorb all the complications. You can use that money for your daughter, Zara, correct? 7 years old. That's plenty of holiday gifts. The reference to Zara's name struck Marcus like a punch. These people had investigated him. They knew about his daughter. They possessed details about his existence. How? Why? What happens next will flip this night completely, expose a reality nobody anticipated, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest strength. Stay tuned to discover what unfolds. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Marcus retreated a step, reflexively creating space between himself and Kane. How do you know my daughter's name? Kane lifted his shoulders, unfazed by being exposed. It's publicly accessible. School databases. We prefer to understand who we're negotiating with. Single father, 2 jobs, barely scraping by. We're not criticizing. We're presenting an opportunity. $50,000 would transform your situation. And what do you need with this place? Marcus questioned, his voice firmer than he felt inside. It's been deserted for 30 years. Why does it suddenly matter? Development, Kane responded seamlessly. Cedar Falls is expanding. This land sits perfectly for commercial application. We're envisioning luxury apartments, perhaps a boutique resort. This region is primed for growth. Marcus glanced beyond him to where the younger man positioned himself by the SUV, monitoring the exchange with vacant, detached eyes. This wasn't about apartments. This centered on something else entirely. They'd arrived too swiftly, too organized, proposing excessive money for a property they allegedly missed acquiring by coincidence. I'll consider it, Marcus said, beginning to shut the door. Kane's hand darted out, halting the door, not violently, but decisively. I genuinely believe you should weigh this carefully. This property carries a complex past. The former owner, Bernard Caldwell, he encountered difficulties near the end, created some adversaries, left certain matters unfinished. You don't want to inherit those complications. It was a warning, disguised, but unmistakable. Maya felt anger spark in his chest, burning away some of the fear. "Are you threatening me?" "Not at all." Kane withdrew his hand and lifted it in a calming gesture. "I'm simply trying to help you sidestep trouble. Take the weekend, think it through, but understand this offer won't stay on the table forever. By Monday, our number might change. Market shifts. You know how it is." He turned back toward the SUV. The younger man opened the door for him, and both climbed inside. The vehicle eased backward, turned, and rolled down the gravel lane. Marcus remained in the doorway, watching until they vanished into the trees. His hand shook so hard he had to hold the frame to steady himself. They knew. Somehow, Apex Development knew there was something valuable tied to this land. They'd known 30 years earlier when they went after Bernard, and they knew now. The only question was, how much did they know? Did they know about the trunk? The fortune buried beneath the shop? Or were they gambling, trying to scare him into selling before he uncovered anything? He closed and locked the door, then leaned against it, forcing his breathing to slow. He'd stepped into something dangerous, something that had shattered Bernard's life. And now these men were circling him, dropping his daughter's name, signaling they would do whatever was necessary to get what they wanted. He returned to the storage closet and dragged out the canvas duffel. He couldn't leave it here now. If Apex Development had this place on their radar, they could come back when he wasn't around. They could break in, search, discover the trunk. He had to move everything important somewhere safer. But where? His apartment wasn't secure. He barely trusted the flimsy deadbolt on his front door. He needed backup. But who could he actually trust? Marcus's mind went to the letter Bernard had written to his sister, Lillian. If Lillian was still alive, she'd be in her 70s or 80s. But she might hold the missing pieces. She might know the full story of what happened to Bernard, why Apex Development cared so much about this property, what secrets it held beyond the money in the trunk. He pulled out his phone and searched for Lillian Caldwell in Montana. 3 results appeared. 1 in Missoula, 1 in Helena, 1 in a town called Redwater about 2 hours south. Marcus opened each listing, scanning for signs. The Helena Lillian was too young, only 45. The Missoula listing had no age attached, but the Redwater Lillian had a profile photo that made his heart lurch. The woman in the picture was elderly, with white hair and gentle eyes. On the shelf behind her, Marcus could just make out a small ceramic elf that looked identical to one he'd seen downstairs in the workshop. He saved the address and phone number, then checked the time. 1:15, less than 2 hours before school dismissal. Not enough to drive to Redwater and back, but maybe enough for a phone call, to start digging for answers, to find someone who could help him understand what he was now part of. Marcus locked up the Holiday Haven, tossed the duffel into his trunk under an old blanket, and slid into the driver's seat. He started the engine and sat there, staring at Lillian Caldwell's number glowing on his screen. His thumb hovered over the call icon. Once he made this call, once he spoke to Bernard's sister, there would be no undoing it. He'd be admitting the trunk existed, admitting he'd found it, pulling another person into a secret that already felt dangerous. But he couldn't handle this alone. He was a diner server and inventory clerk with a 7-year-old daughter to protect. He knew nothing about bearer bonds or rare coins or how to stand up to rich developers with shadowy motives. He needed direction. He needed someone who had known Bernard, who understood what he'd wanted, who could help him choose the right path. Marcus hit the call button before doubt could stop him. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. He was about to hang up when a woman answered, her voice edged with age but still steady. "Hello?" "Hi. Is this Lillian Caldwell?" "It is." "Who's calling?" Marcus took a breath. "My name is Marcus Bennett. I live in Cedar Falls. I recently purchased a property that used to belong to your brother Bernard." The silence on the other end stretched so long Marcus thought the call had dropped. Then Lillian spoke, her voice trembling. "Bernard's Holiday Haven. Someone finally bought the shop." "Yes." Yesterday at auction. And you're calling because you found something. It wasn't a question. Marcus's throat tightened. How did you know? Lillian let out a long, wavering breath. Because Bernard told me to wait for this call. Told me that someday someone would discover what he'd hidden. Someone who would need guidance. My God, I'd stopped believing. 30 years. 30 years I've been waiting. Her voice cracked. What did you find, son? Marcus looked around the empty car, at the snow-blanketed evergreens closing in on all sides, at the canvas duffel concealed in his trunk holding a fortune and a deceased man's mission. Everything, he whispered. I found everything, and I don't know what to do. Then you'd better come see me, Lillian said firmly. Because there are things you need to understand. Things Bernard made me swear to tell whoever discovered his legacy. Things about why he fled, what he was safeguarding, and what you're facing now that you've opened that trunk. How did you know about the trunk? Marcus asked. Lillian's laugh carried bitterness and sorrow. Because I helped him construct it, dear. And I've been praying for 30 years that the right soul would discover it. Now you'd better tell me, are you that person? Are you brave enough to complete what my brother began? Marcus looked at the holiday haven in his rearview mirror, at the place where Bernard had devoted his life to giving, where he'd concealed a fortune intended for children, where he'd made his final stand against people who prized wealth over compassion. He thought about Zara, about the future he was attempting to create, about the decision he faced between safety and something far more perilous but infinitely more purposeful. Yes, Marcus said quietly. I think I am. The journey south. The drive to Redwater took Marcus 2 hours and 17 minutes through twisting mountain highways that made his old Camry groan and labor. He'd collected Zara from school, explained they were taking a short trip, and packed a bag with snacks and coloring books. Zara sat in the back seat, watching the snow-draped evergreens stream past, asking questions Marcus couldn't fully answer yet. Where are we going? To meet someone who knew the man who owned that old building. Why? Because she has information we need. What kind of information? The important kind, kiddo. Lillian Caldwell's house occupied the end of a peaceful street where the mountains climbed like titans against the winter sky. It was a modest ranch-style dwelling with a slate roof and flower boxes that would burst with color in spring but now cradled only snow. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and golden light radiated from the windows. Marcus parked and stared at the entrance, suddenly hesitant. What was he doing? He'd driven 2 hours to meet a stranger based on a phone conversation and instinct. He had a fortune in bearer bonds concealed under a blanket in his trunk. He had a 7-year-old who needed consistency, not chaos. This was reckless. But before he could reconsider, the front door swung open. An elderly woman appeared in the doorway wrapped in a thick cardigan, white hair gathered in a bun. She looked exactly like her profile picture, but more weathered, more delicate. Yet there was steel in her gaze, a resolve that instantly reminded Marcus of the precise handwriting in Bernard's letters. This woman had endured something difficult. Multiple difficult things. Lillian beckoned them inside. Marcus gripped Zara's hand and the canvas duffel, and they walked up the pathway together. The warmth enveloped them immediately, heat and the aroma of fresh coffee and something baking. Lillian's home felt inviting, filled with books and photographs and plush furniture that encouraged you to settle in and linger. You must be Marcus, Lillian said, her voice sturdy despite her years. And this lovely young lady must be Zara. Zara smiled bashfully, tucking herself slightly behind Marcus's leg. Lillian's expression softened. I have cookies in the kitchen, sweetheart, and hot cocoa. Would you like some while your dad and I chat? Zara glanced up at Marcus, who nodded. That would be great. Thank you. They arranged themselves in the living room, Zara content in the kitchen with cookies and cartoons on a small TV while Marcus and Lillian sat across from each other at a coffee table laden with photograph albums. Lillian poured coffee from a carafe with trembling hands, then settled back and studied Marcus with an intensity that made him want to look away. Show me, Lillian said simply. Marcus hesitated, then reached into the canvas duffel and extracted one of Bernard's letters, the one addressed to Lillian. He passed it across the table and watched as the old woman unfolded it with careful reverence. Lillian's eyes welled with tears as she read, her lips tracing words she'd probably committed to memory decades earlier. He was petrified, Lillian whispered. My Bernard, who'd never feared anything, was absolutely petrified at the end. Marcus leaned forward. On the phone, you said Bernard was your brother. But this letter, the way he wrote to you, it feels different. More formal. Lillian placed the letter down delicately, as if it might crumble. She remained silent for a long moment, hands clasped in her lap, gaze far away. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the burden of 30 years of hidden truths. Bernard wasn't my brother. He was my father. Marcus's breath stopped. Your father? Lillian nodded slowly. I misled you on the phone because I had to confirm you were genuine. That you'd actually discovered what he concealed. My father and I had a complicated bond. I loved him, but I also held resentment. He poured so much into other people's children while I grew up feeling like an afterthought. I left Cedar Falls when I was 23, married someone my father didn't approve of, and we barely communicated for years. By the time I grasped what he'd been attempting to accomplish, by the time I wanted to repair things, it was too late. He'd vanished. She reached for a photograph album and opened it to a page marked with a silk ribbon. This is who Bernard truly was. Marcus examined the photos. They displayed a younger Lillian, perhaps 16, standing alongside Bernard in front of the holiday haven. Other images captured them together at different stages, Lillian as a child perched on Bernard's shoulders, as a teenager assisting in the shop, as a young woman in a graduation cap with Bernard grinning beside her. But tension showed in some of the later photos, a gap in their proximity. He wasn't flawless, Lillian continued. He immersed himself in that shop, in his charitable mission, because he couldn't confront his own anguish. My mother passed when I was 5. Heart disease. Bernard never healed. He channeled everything into helping strangers because he couldn't help himself. Couldn't help me. I grew up in that shop surrounded by children receiving presents while my father was too occupied, too distracted, too absorbed by his purpose to truly notice me. Marcus's throat constricted. He recognized that species of pain, the hollow feeling of a parent who was there physically but absent emotionally. I'm sorry. Lillian waved a hand. It was ages ago, and I eventually understood. When I had my own kids, when I experienced how challenging it was to balance everything, I recognized my father had been doing his best. He simply had a mission larger than either of us knew how to manage. She paused, sipping her coffee. Now tell me, what exactly did you discover? Marcus pulled out his phone and displayed the photos he'd captured, the trunk, the bonds, the coins, the stock certificates, the ledger recording 35 years of anonymous generosity. With each image, Lillian's eyes widened, her hand rising to cover her mouth. Sweet, merciful heaven, she breathed. It's real. It's all real. I thought perhaps he'd overstated things in his letters. Maybe the fear had distorted his judgment. But this is precisely what he described. He liquidated everything. Transformed it all. $300 million hidden in a trunk beneath his shop. Actually, Marcus said carefully, based on what I'm seeing, the appreciation of those stocks, the current market value of those coins, I think we're looking at closer to $450 million. Maybe more. The figure suspended itself in the air between them like something too immense to grasp. Lillian leaned back, eyes shut, breathing deliberately. $450 million, intended for children, locked away for 30 years while children went hungry, went without, woke up on Christmas morning to empty stockings. She opened her eyes, and they burned with an emotion Marcus couldn't quite identify. Fury, sorrow, resolve. Tell me what you intend to do with it. Marcus set his coffee mug down with trembling hands. Bernard's letter said it was supposed to fund a foundation to help kids in need. That's what he wanted, right? That's what this was all for. Lillian nodded. He spent years organizing it. Had attorneys draft paperwork. The foundation was going to be called Forever Giving. It would support children year-round, not just holidays, medical treatment, schooling, meals, shelter, whatever they required. He wanted to build a safety net that would endure for generations. Then that's what we should do, Marcus said, startled by the firmness in his own voice. We should complete what he started. We. Lillian's eyebrows lifted. Son, do you comprehend what you're proposing? This isn't simply about handing out money. The instant you surface with $450 million in bearer bonds and rare collectibles, you'll have the IRS crawling all over you. You'll have attorneys, accountants, auditors, every schemer and fraud in the state appearing with their palms extended. And then there's Apex Development. Marcus straightened. You know about them. Of course I know about them. Lillian's voice sharpened. They're the reason my father spent the final 14 years of his life in hiding. They're the reason he died isolated in an assisted living facility under a fabricated name, too terrified to contact family, too afraid they'd locate him if he made any connection. She leaned closer. Apex Development isn't merely a property firm. Back in the 90s, they were a cover for something darker. Organized crime ties, political manipulation, financial schemes. They wanted my father's land because it sits above a natural aquifer. Pure mountain spring water worth billions if exploited properly. Marcus's stomach plummeted. The water rights. Precisely. Bernard didn't even realize. He assumed they wanted his 7 acres for construction projects. But they understood what lay beneath. They likely still do. And now you own that land, and they're going to target you exactly as they targeted him. They already have, Marcus said quietly. Yesterday, a man named Richard Kane appeared at the Haven offering to purchase the property. He knew details about me, about Zara. He made it obvious the offer wasn't really optional. Lillian's face drained of color. Kane. Richard Kane. He was involved back then too, younger, less senior in the structure, but he was present. I remember Bernard mentioning that name in his letters. She rose abruptly, crossed to the window, gazed out at the dimming sky. You need to abandon this. Sell them the property, accept whatever they're proposing, and vanish. You have a daughter to consider. I can't, Marcus said, startled by his own certainty. I won't. Your father devoted his entire existence to helping kids. He surrendered everything, gave up his own contentment, his relationship with you, his security, all of it, so this money could make a difference. I can't allow men like Kane to prevail. I can't let Bernard's sacrifice mean nothing. Lillian turned, tears coursing down her lined face. They'll ruin you. They ruined him. Then I'll strategize better than he did. Marcus stood, moved to join Lillian at the window. Your father was isolated. He didn't have allies. Didn't have resources. Didn't understand what he faced until too late. But I have advantages he lacked. I have you. I have documentation. I have evidence of everything backed up in multiple locations. And I have something else. What's that? Marcus thought of the people in Cedar Falls, the struggling families, the single parents like him, the children who went to bed hungry, the tight-knit community that had quietly crumbled over decades of economic hardship. I have people who need this. Bernard's foundation wasn't just about charity. It was about hope, about proving that someone cared. Cedar Falls has been declining slowly for 30 years. What if this could revive it? What if we could finally accomplish what Bernard envisioned? Lillian studied Marcus's face for a long moment, then slowly smiled. It was melancholy and proud and something else Marcus couldn't quite name. You remind me of him. Not physically, but the determination. The stubborn conviction that one person can shift the world. She dried her eyes. All right. If we're doing this, we're doing it properly. We'll need attorneys, excellent ones. We'll need accountants who understand how to manage this scale of wealth. We'll need protection. And we'll need to act quickly before Apex realizes what you discovered. They spent the next 3 hours at Lillian's kitchen table, Zara now sleeping peacefully on the sofa, while they strategized. Lillian had connections from her years working as a paralegal in Billings. She knew professionals who knew professionals. By the time Marcus departed at 9:30 that evening, they had the framework of a plan. First thing Monday morning, they'd consult with an attorney Lillian trusted, a woman named Patricia Hammond who specialized in estate law and non-profit foundations. They'd initiate the process of legally claiming the treasure, establishing the foundation, and shielding Marcus from both legal complications and physical danger. The warning. The drive home was dark and silent, Zara breathing softly in the back seat, the canvas duffel now feeling less like a weight and more like a mission Marcus was prepared to accept. He'd crossed a threshold today. He'd committed to something larger than his own survival. And there was no retreat. But when Marcus pulled into the parking lot of his apartment complex just after midnight, he knew instantly something was wrong. His apartment sat on the second floor overlooking the lot. Normally, the windows would be pitch black. Tonight, lights blazed from inside, and his front door hung ajar. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd locked that door. He always locked it. He threw the car into park, lifted Zara, who stirred groggily, and sprinted for the stairs. "Dad, what's wrong?" Zara mumbled, still half-conscious. "Stay right beside me, kiddo. Hold my hand tight." They reached the apartment and Marcus's worst suspicions became concrete reality. The place had been torn apart. Drawers yanked out and emptied. Couch cushions ripped open. His laptop missing. Documents strewn everywhere. Someone had gutted his home searching for something, searching for evidence of the treasure, searching for the bonds he'd been cautious enough not to leave here. Marcus pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called 911. While he waited for police, he conducted a rapid assessment. They'd taken his laptop, an aging TV, some modest jewelry he'd kept from his grandmother. Items a typical burglar would grab. But they'd also rifled through his financial records, his mail, anything that might yield information. This wasn't opportunistic. This was deliberate. The police arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers, professional and courteous, who documented the scene and took his statement. They posed the standard questions. Any disputes? Any reason someone would single you out? Marcus lied smoothly. "No, officer. I'm just a server at a diner. I can't imagine why anyone would do this." The officers promised to file a report, recommended upgraded locks, and left him standing amid the ruins of his home. Zara clung to Marcus's side, eyes wide with alarm. "Dad, why would someone wreck our things?" Marcus crouched down, embraced his daughter. "I don't know, sweetheart. But we're okay. That's what counts. We're safe." But they weren't safe. Marcus understood that now. Apex Development had delivered a message. They demonstrated how easily they could access him, how exposed he was, how much he stood to lose. And this was just the beginning. Marcus spent the remainder of the night cleaning while Zara slept restlessly in her bed. He'd shoved the dresser against the door, creating a barrier that wouldn't deter anyone serious but made him feel marginally less vulnerable as he gathered scattered photos and shattered plates. His phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. "You have something that belongs to us. Return it or next time we won't be so gentle. You have 48 hours. Marcus stared at the message, hands trembling with fear and rage. They'd violated his home. They'd frightened his daughter. They'd shown him precisely how far they'd go. And they expected him to simply surrender a fortune meant for children because they'd intimidated him. He thought of Bernard, spending 14 years concealed, dying isolated and terrified. He thought of Lillian, who'd lost her father to fear and greed. He thought of Zara, innocent and trusting, who deserved to mature in a world where bullies didn't always prevail. And he made a decision. Marcus texted back 4 words, "Come and take it." It was reckless. It was probably foolish. But it was also honest. He wasn't surrendering. Not now. Not ever. Standing ground. The following morning, Marcus dropped Zara off at school with an embrace that lasted too long and promises he hoped he could honor. Then he drove straight to the Cedar Falls Community Center, a modest brick structure on Main Street that functioned as the town's hub. He'd called ahead, requested the meeting space from the director. He'd contacted local news channels. He'd reached out to everyone he could imagine who might care about what he was about to reveal. By 10 o'clock, 47 people had gathered. Locals Marcus recognized from the truck stop and the tool shop. Parents, educators, shop owners, seniors. They occupied folding chairs, appearing curious and doubtful. Marcus positioned himself at the front, knees trembling, no rehearsed remarks, just truth and urgency. "Thank you for coming," he started, his voice firmer than he felt. "Most of you know me. I'm Marcus Bennett. I work at the truck stop and the tool shop. I'm a single dad trying to survive just like many of you. And 4 days ago, I did something impulsive. I bought the old Holiday Haven for $12. That triggered whispers. Everyone knew about the auction. Small towns gossiped. I purchased it thinking maybe I could restore it, maybe convert it into workspace or lease it. But when I arrived, I discovered something. Something Bernard Caldwell left behind. A treasure. An authentic one. Bearer bonds. Rare coins. Stock certificates. Current worth approximately $450 million. The room exploded. People jumped up. Voices erupted in disbelief. Someone chuckled. Someone else yelled that he'd lost his mind. Marcus raised his hands, waiting for silence. "I have evidence. Photographs, documents, everything. And I understand what you're thinking, that money belongs to me now, correct? I discovered it. I own the land. It's mine. But it isn't. It never was. Bernard Caldwell allocated that money before he even possessed it. He devoted it to supporting children, to building a foundation that would ensure no kid in this community went without. And then he was intimidated, chased off, compelled to conceal everything he'd built. And it's been locked away in a cellar for 30 years while our town deteriorated." Marcus's voice faltered. He thought of Zara, of the families he served at the truck stop who calculated their coins to afford breakfast, of the kids at school wearing jackets too small, of the silent desperation that lingered over Cedar Falls like the winter fog that never completely lifted. "I want to complete what Bernard initiated," he continued. "I want to create the Forever Giving Foundation. I want to utilize that money the way it was intended. Medical treatment for kids who require it, college funding, meal programs, housing assistance, youth programs, everything this town needs to start believing again." The room had fallen quiet. People observed him like he'd sprouted wings. "But I need your support. Because the people who intimidated Bernard 30 years ago are back. They broke into my apartment last night. They've given me 48 hours to surrender the treasure. And if I refuse, I don't know what they'll do. So I'm asking you, all of you, to stand with me, to help me safeguard what Bernard left behind, to show these people that Cedar Falls doesn't retreat when someone tries to intimidate us." For a long moment, nobody stirred. Marcus's heart dropped. He'd misjudged this. These people had their own struggles. They didn't have the bandwidth or strength to fight his battles. He'd asked too much. Then a man in the rear row rose. Marcus recognized him, David Chen, who managed the tool shop where he worked evenings. "I'm in," he said plainly. "Bernard helped my family 20 years ago. Anonymous donation covered our rent for 6 months after my father got injured. We never discovered who did it, but I always had my suspicions. Time to return the favor." A woman stood next. "Bernard paid for my son's operation in 1987. $15,000 showed up in an envelope in our mailbox. No signature, no sender. He's alive because of that gift. I'll support this however I can." Then another person stood. And another. And another. One by one, people rose to their feet, each sharing a story of how Bernard had impacted their lives, assisted their families, provided hope when they had none. Stories Marcus hadn't heard. Stories that had circulated quietly for decades but never verified. Stories of a man who'd silently sustained an entire community through his anonymous kindness. By the time everyone who wanted to speak had spoken, all 47 people were standing, and Marcus was overcome, realizing he wasn't isolated. That Bernard's legacy wasn't just wealth in a trunk. It was the lives he'd transformed, the hope he'd sown, the community he'd nurtured, one household at a time. "So what do we do?" someone called out. Marcus cleared his throat. "We fight. We establish the foundation legitimately. We get the treasure verified and transferred properly. We generate so much attention that Apex Development can't touch us without everyone watching. We protect one another, and we ensure Bernard Caldwell's vision finally becomes reality." The fight. The next 48 hours became a whirlwind. Patricia Hammond, the attorney Lillian had recommended, arrived from Billings with a team of paralegals. They worked non-stop filing documents, establishing the foundation, building legal safeguards. The story reached local news, then regional, then national. Single father discovers hidden fortune intended for charity, faces intimidation from mysterious corporation. It was the type of story that seized attention, that made people invest emotionally. Volunteers from the community organized shifts guarding Marcus's apartment and the holiday haven. David coordinated it like a tactical mission, people working in rotations, maintaining contact, ensuring no one was ever isolated or exposed. Zara stayed with Lillian in Redwater, removed from the turmoil and possible threat. And throughout it all, Apex Development remained silent. No additional threats, no more intrusions, just an ominous stillness that felt more menacing than any warning. On the third day, Richard Kane contacted Marcus directly. He answered on speaker with Patricia Hammond present, documenting everything. "Mr. Bennett," Kane's polished voice filled the space. "I see you've made your choice." "I have," Marcus said steadily. "You're making an error. That treasure isn't legally yours. Bernard Caldwell had obligations, liabilities. There are entities with valid claims to those assets. Then they can address it with the Foundation's board of directors," Patricia cut in. "Everything is proceeding properly. The treasure has been declared. Taxes will be handled. The Foundation is being registered as a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. If anyone has a legitimate claim, they're welcome to pursue it through appropriate legal processes." Kane paused. "Then this isn't finished." "No," Marcus confirmed. "It's just starting. And this time, you're not confronting one frightened man. You're confronting all of us." He disconnected. His hands trembled, but his resolve was solid. He'd made his stand. He'd established his boundary. And whatever followed, he was prepared. The legal battle began exactly 1 week after Marcus's phone call with Richard Kane. Apex Development filed a lawsuit claiming they held a promissory note from Bernard Caldwell dating back to 1993, a debt of $175,000 that had supposedly gone unpaid for 30 years. With interest and penalties, they claimed they were owed over $2 million, making them creditors with first rights to any assets discovered on the property. Patricia Hammond sat across from Marcus in a cramped office above the Cedar Falls Library that had become their makeshift headquarters. She'd reviewed the documents Apex had filed, and her expression was severe. "It's a forgery," she said flatly. "A skilled one, but still fabricated. The problem is proving it. They've backdated everything, created a paper trail that appears legitimate on the surface. Fighting this in court could take years." Marcus felt his stomach sink. Years. Zara would be a teenager by the time this resolved. The Foundation would be trapped in litigation, unable to help anyone. Bernard's treasure would remain frozen while attorneys argued and families continued to suffer. "So what do we do?" Patricia leaned back, tapping her pen against the desk. "We go on the offensive. We don't just defend against their claim. We investigate them. Apex Development has been operating in Montana for 40 years. There's no way they've stayed clean that long. We find their skeletons, we expose them, and we force them to withdraw or risk everything surfacing. That takes money, Marcus said quietly. Money I don't have. The treasure is locked up pending the lawsuit. I can barely afford groceries right now. You have something better than money. Patricia gestured out the window where volunteers were unloading supplies from trucks in the parking lot below. You have a movement. Use it. The community awakens. Over the next month, Cedar Falls transformed into something Marcus had never witnessed before. The community that had been quietly fading for decades suddenly came alive, energized by purpose and collective mission. People who hadn't communicated in years started collaborating. Old resentments were abandoned. The entire town mobilized around protecting Bernard's legacy and the future it promised. David Chen organized research teams, retired educators, librarians, anyone with technical skills, who combed through public records, archived newspapers, court documents, anything that might reveal Apex Development's history. They worked in shifts at the library, cross-referencing dates, constructing timelines, connecting patterns that had been deliberately hidden. What they uncovered was devastating. Apex had been involved in 12 separate land acquisitions over 4 decades. And in every single instance, the previous owners had mysteriously vanished, sold under questionable circumstances, or been forced out by intimidation. 3 former landowners had filed restraining orders. 2 had reported harassment to authorities. 1 had died in what was ruled an accidental fire just days before he was scheduled to testify in a lawsuit against Apex. Patricia brought all of this to the district attorney. Initially, the DA hesitated. Apex had influential connections, political contributions, high-powered attorneys. But when local media amplified the story, when journalists started asking pointed questions, when the community made it evident they weren't retreating, pressure intensified. By mid-February, the DA launched a formal investigation into Apex Development's business practices. The lawsuit continued, but momentum had reversed. Apex's lawyers attempted to expedite the proceedings, clearly seeking resolution before the criminal investigation exposed too much. Patricia countered brilliantly, filing motion after motion, demanding every piece of evidence, prolonging the process while investigators tightened their net. Meanwhile, Marcus's life had become unrecognizable. He'd left both his jobs, unable to handle the demands of the foundation work and his previous obligations. Money was frighteningly scarce, but the community rallied. Someone anonymously covered his rent for 3 months. The truck stop owner started sending meals home with Zara. David provided him a stipend for the administrative work he was handling. It wasn't charity, they all maintained. It was investment in their collective future. Zara had been surprisingly adaptable through all of it. She grasped they were fighting for something meaningful, even if the specifics exceeded her 7-year-old understanding. Lillian had become like a grandmother to her, and Zara spent weekends in Redwater learning to bake and hearing stories about Bernard that made him feel less like a mystery and more like family. On a frigid morning in late March, Patricia called Marcus with news that made his legs go weak. The DA is filing charges: wire fraud, extortion, racketeering. They've secured 3 witnesses willing to testify about threats and coercion. Richard Kane has been arrested. Apex's assets are being frozen pending the criminal trial. Marcus dropped onto the steps of the Holiday Haven where he'd been supervising restoration. What does this mean for the lawsuit? It means they're withdrawing it. Their attorneys filed a motion to dismiss this morning. They're limiting their exposure, trying to minimize the fallout. The treasure is yours, Marcus. Legally, officially, completely yours. Well, the foundations. You can begin allocating funds immediately. Marcus disconnected and broke down right there on the deck. Volunteers working inside rushed out, alarmed, and he had to gesture them back, laughing and weeping simultaneously. We won, he managed to say. We actually won. Victory and transformation. The celebration that evening in Cedar Falls was spontaneous and euphoric. Someone produced a portable speaker. Someone else materialized with folding tables and dishes. The parking lot of the community center flooded with people dancing, embracing, crying with relief and victory. They'd stood united against something larger and more powerful, and they prevailed. Not because they had superior resources or fancier attorneys, but because they'd refused to surrender. Marcus found himself caught in embrace after embrace, people thanking him, celebrating his courage, calling him a hero. But he didn't feel heroic. He felt like someone who'd encountered something remarkable and simply refused to abandon it. The real heroes were Bernard, who'd constructed this legacy, Lillian, who'd waited 30 years for someone to discover it, Patricia, who'd fought masterfully in courtrooms, and all these people, this community that had unified when it counted most. The transformation of Bernard's holiday haven began that spring. Contractors volunteered labor. Building suppliers provided materials at reduced rates. The entire town appeared on weekends to assist with demolition, construction, painting, landscaping. What had been a deteriorating monument became something dynamic and purposeful. The main retail area was redesigned into a community center. Large windows admitted natural light. The old shelving that had once displayed toys now presented information about foundation services. Bernard's original holiday costume was mounted in a display case, a tribute to the man who'd initiated everything. The workshop section became offices for foundation personnel. The living quarters upstairs were reimagined as emergency family shelter, a place where people in crisis could stay temporarily while rebuilding stability. But the cellar, the sacred space where the treasure had remained for 3 decades, became something extraordinary. Marcus and Lillian designed it together as a memorial. The trunk sat centered, empty now but restored and magnificent. Surrounding it, they exhibited Bernard's ledgers, his photographs, his letters. They presented his story truthfully, including the complicated relationship with Lillian, his struggles, his anxieties, his ultimate sacrifice. It wasn't a story of a flawless man. It was the story of a genuine person who'd tried his utmost to improve the world. The Forever Giving Foundation officially launched on December 24, exactly 30 years after Bernard had concealed his treasure. The ceremony was conducted outside the haven, and over 300 people attended despite the bitter cold. Marcus stood at a hastily assembled podium. Zara stood beside him, fingers wrapped around his, and Lillian sat in the front row under blankets. Marcus's printed speech tore free in the wind, so he spoke from the heart instead. Bernard Caldwell spent his whole life believing one person could make a difference. He proved it every single day for 36 years. And then fear made him doubt, made him hide, made him believe he'd failed. But he was wrong. His legacy didn't die when he ran. It was only waiting for the right moment, the right people, the right town to bring it back to life. He paused, taking in the faces before him. People he'd poured coffee for, rung up at the tool shop, passed on the sidewalk with tired nods. Neighbors who'd become family through everything they'd endured together. The foundation starts today with $450 million. That's enough to help thousands of families, to change more lives than we can count, to give kids chances they never dreamed of. But the real treasure isn't the money. It's what we've learned about who we are. About what happens when we stand together. About refusing to let bullies win. About keeping promises even when it costs us. He looked down at Zara, whose eyes shone with pride and something deeper, hope. Bernard's dream was a community where every child matters, where every family has support, where no one has to face hard times alone. Starting today, that dream is real. The Forever Giving Foundation is open, and we're going to spend the rest of our lives proving Bernard Caldwell was right to believe. Applause thundered across the lot, bouncing off the mountains and through the pines. Marcus stepped back and felt Lillian's hand close around his. She was crying, but she was smiling too, a smile of release, of healing, of joy so fierce it seemed to shine out of her. The foundation's work began immediately. The first grants went to 12 families flagged as needing urgent aid, single parents behind on rent, households crushed by medical debt, kids without glasses, coats, or basic supplies. Staff, locals from Cedar Falls trained over the previous months, delivered checks in person along with details on ongoing programs. Marcus insisted on joining some of those visits. He needed to see Bernard's vision in motion, to watch hope flicker back into people's eyes. He knew what it felt like to stand on the edge with no way forward and then receive help you never expected. One visit stayed with him forever. A woman named Sarah, mid-30s but aged by fear and exhaustion, opened the door of a shabby apartment with 2 small children clinging to her legs. She'd just left an abusive partner and was juggling 3 part-time jobs to survive. When Marcus explained that the foundation was providing $15,000 for immediate needs plus ongoing support for child care and job training, Sarah simply folded. She sank to the floor and sobbed, her children hugging her, not fully understanding but sensing that everything had just changed. Marcus sat beside her, took her hand, and whispered, "You're not alone anymore. None of us are." Another family he would never forget were the Hendersons. Robert Henderson, a veteran who'd served 3 tours overseas, had come home with injuries that ended his construction career. His wife Emily cleaned houses, but with 4 children and staggering medical bills, they were drowning. When Marcus arrived at their small house on the edge of town, the kids were doing homework by candlelight, the power had been cut off. The foundation not only paid off their overdue utilities, it also created a college fund for each child, enrolled Robert in a vocational program tailored to his physical limitations, and covered 6 months of family counseling to help them process the strain and trauma of years spent barely holding on. Case by case, house by house, the fortune that had slept in darkness for 30 years finally did what it was meant to do. It turned fear into breathing room, desperation into possibility, and a tired mountain town into living proof that one person's stubborn kindness could outlast greed, survive terror, and come back stronger in the hands of many. 3 months later, Marcus attended Robert's graduation from the computer programming course the foundation had funded. He had a job lined up, benefits, a future. Emily had wept in Marcus's arms, whispering repeatedly, "You gave us our lives back." But it wasn't Marcus who'd given them anything. It was Bernard. It was the community. It was the collective choice that no family should slip through when resources existed to support them. By summer, the foundation had assisted 83 families directly and launched 5 community programs, an after-school tutoring center where kids received homework help and hot meals, a medical clinic offering free care to uninsured children, a job training program teaching marketable skills, a scholarship fund for high school seniors, and a small business grant program helping entrepreneurs launch ventures in Cedar Falls, bringing economic vitality back to a town that had been slowly emptying for years. The scholarship program became particularly meaningful to Marcus. The first recipient was a girl named Emma Rodriguez, 17, brilliant, who'd been accepted to the state university but had no means to pay. Her single father worked at the gas station, proud but struggling. Emma had been preparing to decline her admission, to work instead, to abandon her dreams. When Marcus called to tell her she'd received a full-for-year scholarship from the Forever Giving Foundation, Emma had been silent for so long Marcus thought the call had dropped. Then he heard crying, Emma and her father both, and Emma's trembling voice saying, "I get to go. I really get to go." "You really get to go," Marcus confirmed. "And when you graduate, we hope you'll return to Cedar Falls and help the next generation of kids who need someone to believe in them." Emma graduated 4 years later with a degree in social work. She returned to Cedar Falls and joined the foundation staff, becoming Director of Youth Services. She was living proof that investing in one person's education could create ripples lasting decades. The changes were visible everywhere. Houses that had been crumbling got restored. Main Street, which had been half vacant, started filling with new businesses. Young families who'd left Cedar Falls began returning, drawn by opportunity and community. The school, which had faced closure due to low enrollment, suddenly had a waiting list. The medical clinic, staffed by a doctor who'd grown up in Cedar Falls and had always wanted to return but couldn't afford to open a practice, became a lifeline. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to David, saw an average of 40 patients weekly. She diagnosed diabetes in children who'd never had regular checkups. She caught cancers early enough to treat. She provided prenatal care to mothers who otherwise would have had none. She saved lives, literally saved lives, because Bernard Caldwell had believed children deserved health care. One afternoon, Dr. Chen called Marcus to the clinic. There was someone who wanted to meet him. Marcus arrived to find a teenage boy, maybe 16, sitting in the waiting room with his mother. The boy's name was Tyler. 6 months earlier, the clinic had discovered he had a heart condition that would have killed him within a year if untreated. The foundation had paid for his surgery, a procedure costing over $200,000 that his family could never have afforded. Tyler stood when Marcus entered, awkward and shy, and held out a drawing he'd made. It showed the holiday haven with Bernard standing in front, and beside him Marcus and Zara, and surrounding them dozens of families holding hands. At the top in careful letters he'd written, "Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they just care." Marcus's vision blurred with tears. He embraced Tyler and his mother, and later he had that drawing framed and hung in his office beside Bernard's photograph. On the difficult days when the work felt crushing and the problems seemed endless, he'd look at it and remember why every single struggle mattered. But the most profound changes were harder to measure. Pine Ridge, the community spirit that had been dying, started healing. People stopped just surviving and started living again. Children grew up knowing someone cared about their future. Parents went to bed at night with less fear gnawing at them. The town that had been quietly fading rediscovered hope, not because one person had left a fortune, but because a community had chosen to honor that gift by taking care of each other. Vincent Olaris' legacy wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in lives transformed, in dignity restored, in a town that refused to let greed and fear win. And it all started with one struggling mother who paid $12 for an abandoned building and found something worth far more than money. She found purpose. She found family. She found proof that one person's stubborn belief in goodness could outlast any darkness, as long as others were willing to carry it forward. There was energy in Cedar Falls now, a sense of possibility that hadn't been felt in years. People smiled more. They paused to talk on the sidewalks instead of rushing past. Neighbors checked on one another, inspired by Bernard's example and by the way their town had rallied to defend his legacy. The foundation hadn't just moved money, it had reminded people what they could do when they pulled in the same direction. Marcus's own life had changed just as dramatically. The man who'd been scraping by, exhausted and alone, was now the executive director of a multi-million-dollar foundation. He'd gone from pouring coffee to leading a staff of 17, from counting every dollar of grocery money to managing program budgets, from being invisible to someone kids recognized on the street, waving and shouting, "Mr. Marcus." He never forgot where he'd started. He insisted on keeping his office in the Haven, in the same modest room where Bernard had once lived. He drove the same old Camry, now past 200,000 miles. He and Zara still stayed in their small apartment, even though they could have afforded far more. The foundation paid him a reasonable salary, $60,000 a year, enough for stability but not excess. The work was never about enriching himself. It was about honoring Bernard's vision. Zara blossomed in ways that made Marcus's chest ache with gratitude. She'd watched her dad take on something huge and refused to back down. She'd learned that courage didn't mean never being afraid, it meant being scared and doing the right thing anyway. She'd seen a whole town stand up together and felt firsthand the power of kindness and hope. Those lessons were worth more than any inheritance. On weekends, Zara volunteered at the foundation, sorting donated supplies, helping with drives, reading to younger kids at the after-school program. One evening, while they cooked dinner in their cramped kitchen, she said, "When I grow up, I want to do what you do. I want to help people." Marcus had to turn away to hide the tears in his eyes. His daughter had absorbed the deepest truth: a life spent serving others was a life well lived. On the one-year anniversary of finding the trunk, Marcus hosted a small dinner at the Haven. Just a few people: Lillian, now 83 but still sharp and active on the board, Patricia Hammond, by then not only their attorney but a close friend, David Chen, and a handful of community leaders who'd been there from the beginning, and, of course, Zara, sitting beside Marcus and listening intently as the adults talked. They ate simple food, spaghetti and salad, and traded stories about the year behind them, the fear, the court dates, the first scholarships, the first families whose lights had stayed on because a check arrived in time. Someone raised a glass to Bernard, but Lillian shook her head. "Not just to Bernard," she said, her voice steady. "To Marcus. Because finding a treasure is one thing. Having the courage to fight for it, to use it the way it was meant to be used, to risk yourself and your child for the sake of people you barely knew, that's extraordinary. My father would have been so proud of you." Marcus felt tears sting his own eyes. "I was just trying to do the right thing." "That's what makes it extraordinary," Lillian replied. "Most people know the right thing. Very few still do it when it gets hard." Later, after everyone had left and Zara was asleep upstairs in one of the family housing rooms, Marcus wandered through the empty workshop. Moonlight poured through the big windows, laying long silver paths across the floor. He could almost sense Bernard there, quiet, satisfied, grateful that someone had finally carried his work across the finish line. He descended into the basement museum, as he often did when he needed perspective. The trunk rested in its pool of light, empty now but gleaming. Marcus traced the carved words along its lid and thought about all they had cost one man, and all they had given back to so many. For those who pursue the essence of generosity, may this illuminate the shadows. It had. And as long as Cedar Falls kept choosing each other over fear, that light would never go out. For those who pursue the essence of generosity, may this illuminate the shadows. "We did it," he whispered to the empty room. "Your dream is real. Children are being helped. Families are being saved. The community you loved so much is alive again. You didn't fail, Bernard. You just needed to wait for the right person to come along. I hope Lillian was wrong. I hope I was just the key that unlocked what you built. You're the real hero here." But even as he said it, Marcus knew the truth was more complicated. Bernard had built the foundation of this miracle, yes, but it had taken a community to bring it to life. It had taken Lillian's patience and Patricia's brilliance and David's organization. It had taken 47 people standing up in a community center and saying, "We're in." It had taken a single father desperate enough to gamble on a $12 property and brave enough to fight when powerful people tried to take it away. The miracle hadn't been one person's creation. It had been a collective act of faith and courage and love. Marcus turned off the lights in the museum and climbed back upstairs. Through the window, he could see Cedar Falls spread out below, lights twinkling in the darkness. Lights in homes where children slept warm and fed. Lights in the new medical clinic where families with sick kids could go without fear of crushing bills. Lights in the community center where teenagers gathered for activities instead of getting into trouble. Lights representing hope, opportunity, second chances. He thought about the person he'd been just 1 year ago, exhausted, barely surviving, convinced his life would always be a struggle, that his daughter would inherit the same cycle of poverty and desperation. He'd been wrong. One moment, one decision, one yes to something that terrified him had changed everything. 1 year later. The next morning, Marcus woke to Zara bouncing on the bed, excited about a field trip to the workshop museum for her second-grade class. As they got ready together, Zara chattering about what she wanted to show her friends, Marcus caught sight of himself in the mirror. He looked different. Not physically, though he'd put on a few healthy pounds and the shadows under his eyes had faded. He looked different in his eyes. They held confidence now, certainty, strength. He drove Zara to school, then headed to the Haven for a full day of meetings, grant applications to review, new family intakes to process, staff evaluations to conduct. A reporter from a national news network wanted to do a follow-up story on how the foundation was doing 1 year later. The mayor was stopping by to discuss a partnership program. It was the kind of day that would have terrified him a year ago. Now it energized him. At lunch, David stopped by with sandwiches from the truck stop. They ate in Marcus's office, talking about plans to expand the scholarship program and maybe establish a satellite location in the next town over, spreading Bernard's legacy beyond Cedar Falls. As David left, he paused at the door. "You know what's wild," he said. "A year ago, Half the people in this town were thinking about leaving, including me. Now nobody wants to go. We've got people moving here. Young families, entrepreneurs, folks who hear about what's happening in Cedar Falls and want to be part of it. He smiled. You brought this place back to life, Marcus. After he left, Marcus sat at his desk, staring at the framed photograph Lillian had given him. It showed Bernard in his prime, maybe 40 years old, standing in front of a holiday tree with a room full of children. His face radiated pure joy, the happiness of someone who'd found their purpose. Marcus had hung it where he could see it every day, a reminder of why this work mattered, what they were fighting to preserve. His phone rang. It was a family he'd helped 6 months ago. The father had been unemployed, they'd been facing eviction. Foundation assistance had given them breathing room. He was calling to say he'd landed a new job. They were stable now, and they wanted to know how they could volunteer, how they could give back, how they could help the next family that needed support. Marcus smiled as he took down their information. This was how it worked. This was how Bernard's vision became eternal, not through one fortune, but through an endless cycle of people helping people, of those who'd been lifted up reaching back to lift others. That evening, as Marcus and Zara walked home through the snowy streets of Cedar Falls, his daughter slipped her hand into his. "Dad," she said, "do you think Mr. Bernard knows what happened? That we finished what he started?" Marcus looked up at the stars breaking through the winter clouds, thinking about a man who'd sacrificed everything for a dream he never got to see realized, and he squeezed his daughter's hand. "Yeah, kiddo," he said softly. "I think he knows. And I think he's proud of all of us." They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, their breath forming clouds in the cold mountain air, the lights of Cedar Falls glowing warm around them, a town reborn, a legacy fulfilled, a promise kept across 30 years and the distance between fear and hope. Bernard Caldwell had paid $12 for a dream and hidden it away when the world became too dangerous. Marcus Bennett had paid the same $12 and had the courage to bring it back to light. But the real price, the one that mattered, had been paid by an entire community that chose to stand together, to believe in something bigger than themselves, to prove that sometimes, against all odds, love and generosity really could win. And in a small Montana town where winter came early and stayed late, where families had struggled for decades and hope had seemed like a luxury nobody could afford, that victory shone brighter than any treasure locked in a chest. It shone in every child who went to bed with a full stomach, every parent who could afford medicine, every teenager who got to dream about college, every neighbor who looked out for another. The Forever Giving Foundation had started with $150 million, but its real wealth couldn't be measured in dollars. It was measured in lives changed, dignity restored, and a community that had learned the most important lesson of all, that we're strongest when we take care of each other, and that the greatest treasures aren't the ones we keep for ourselves, they're the ones we give away. Marcus scheduled them for volunteer orientation and ended the call with a smile. That was the real miracle of what they'd built. It wasn't just about giving, it was about creating a cycle of generosity, showing people they were part of something larger, inspiring them to pay forward the help they'd received. Late that afternoon, Marcus picked up Zara from school and they drove to Lillian's house in Redwater for dinner, something that had become a weekly tradition. As they wound through the mountain roads, Zara reading a book in the back seat, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought them here, the fear and the risk and the impossible odds they'd overcome. He'd paid $12 for an abandoned cabin and found a fortune. But the real treasure hadn't been the bonds or coins. It had been discovering his own strength, learning he was capable of far more than he'd believed, finding a community that would stand with him, building something that would outlast all of them, helping children for generations to come. The final revelation. 2 years after the foundation launched, Marcus received a letter that changed everything he thought he knew about Bernard's story. It came from a lawyer in Billings representing a woman named Catherine Caldwell, who claimed to be Bernard's granddaughter. Marcus's first instinct was skepticism. They dealt with plenty of fraudulent claims in the early days, people emerging from nowhere claiming connections to Bernard, hoping for a piece of the fortune. But this letter was different. It included photographs, birth certificates, DNA test results. Catherine was real. She was Lillian's daughter, which made her Bernard's granddaughter through the complicated family history Marcus had learned about. But what made Marcus's hands shake as he read was the final paragraph. Catherine had something that belonged in the museum, something Bernard had given her grandmother before he disappeared, something he'd wanted found eventually, when the time was right. Marcus and Lillian drove to Billings together to meet Catherine. She was in her mid-50s, a school teacher with kind eyes and her grandfather's gentle smile. She welcomed them into her home and carefully brought out a wooden box, smaller than Bernard's trunk but carved with the same meticulous care. "My mother gave this to me before she passed," Catherine explained. "She said Grandpa Bernard gave it to her right before he left Cedar Falls. Told her to keep it safe, to give it to whoever continued his work. She was waiting all those years for someone to prove they were worthy of his legacy. When she heard about what you were doing, Marcus, she wanted me to bring this to you." Inside the box were letters, dozens of them. Letters from families Bernard had helped over 36 years. Thank you notes from parents whose children had received gifts, gratitude from people whose rent had been paid, whose medical bills had been covered, whose lives had been quietly saved by a man they'd never met. Bernard had kept every single one, evidence that his work had mattered, that his sacrifice had meaning. But there was something else. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in velvet, was a journal. Bernard's personal diary from his final months in Cedar Falls. Marcus read it that night in his office, tears streaming down his face as Bernard's fear and courage poured off the pages. He'd known they were coming for him. He'd known he was going to lose everything. But his final entry, dated December 24, 1993, the night before he disappeared, ended with words that Marcus would have engraved on a plaque in the museum. "I'm afraid tonight, more afraid than I've ever been. But I've made my choice. I would rather lose everything than compromise the mission. These children, these families, they are worth more than my comfort, my safety, my life. If someone finds this, if someone reads these words, please know that I don't regret a single donation, a single sacrifice. The greatest privilege of my life has been serving others. If I've learned anything, it's that wealth means nothing unless it's shared, that power means nothing unless it protects the vulnerable, that a life spent giving is the only life worth living. To whoever continues this work, be brave. Stand firm. Don't let fear win. The children are counting on you." Marcus closed the journal and sat in the darkness of his office, feeling the weight of Bernard's words settle over him like a blessing. The man had given up everything, his business, his home, his relationship with his daughter, his safety, his very identity, and he'd done it without hesitation because he believed in something bigger than himself. Marcus picked up his phone and texted Lillian, "Your father was the bravest man I never met. Thank you for trusting me with his legacy." Her reply came moments later, "He would be so proud of you." "We all are." The journal and letters were added to the museum, displayed alongside the trunk and the photographs and all the other pieces of Bernard's story. They drew visitors from across the state, school groups, families, people who wanted to understand how one person's courage could ripple through decades and transform an entire community. 5 years after finding the trunk, Marcus stood on the same porch where Richard Kane had once threatened him. But this time, he was surrounded by hundreds of people celebrating the Foundation's 5th anniversary. The mayor was giving a speech. A local band played. Children ran through the snow with hot chocolate and laughter. Zara, now 12, stood beside him holding his hand, taller now, confident, already talking about becoming a doctor so she could work at the clinic when she grew up. Marcus looked out at the crowd and saw faces he recognized, families the Foundation had helped, volunteers who gave their time, staff members who'd made this their life's work. He saw Emma Rodriguez, the scholarship recipient who'd come back to lead youth services. He saw Tyler, the teenager whose heart surgery had saved his life, now volunteering at the medical clinic. He saw David Chen and Patricia Hammond and Catherine Caldwell and so many others who'd become part of this extended family built on shared purpose. And in the front row, wrapped in blankets and beaming with pride, sat Lillian, 88 years old, frail but fierce, her father's legacy alive and thriving around her. The speech ended. The crowd applauded. Someone started singing, and soon everyone joined in, their voices rising into the cold Montana night, carrying across the valley and up into the mountains where Bernard Caldwell had once walked, alone and afraid but determined to do the right thing no matter the cost. Marcus closed his eyes and listened to the music, to the laughter, to the sound of a community that had learned to take care of its own. He thought about a $12 gamble that had changed everything, about a trunk hidden in darkness, about a man who'd believed children deserved better and had been willing to sacrifice everything to prove it. Bernard had been right. Fear hadn't won. Love had. Generosity had. Community had. And as long as people like Marcus and Zara and all these others kept the promise alive, Bernard's light would never go out. It would keep shining, one family at a time, one child at a time, one act of courage at a time, proof that sometimes the smallest investments yield the greatest returns, and that the real treasure is never what we find, but what we choose to do with it. I only regret that I won't be there to see the foundation launch, to watch children smile, to know that hope continues. To whoever carries this forward, thank you. You've given my life meaning beyond what I could accomplish alone. That's all any of us can hope for, to plant seeds that bloom long after we're gone. Marcus added Bernard's journal to the museum, displayed alongside the letters of gratitude. They became the most visited exhibit, a window into the heart of a man who'd given everything for people he'd never meet. Bernard Caldwell had spent his life proving one person could make a difference. Marcus Bennett had proven that when one person starts, others will follow, and together they could change the world. The legacy. Anyone can discover hidden treasure if they're brave enough to open doors others have sealed shut, if they're stubborn enough to stand their ground when powerful people try to take what they've found, and if they're wise enough to understand that real wealth isn't measured in dollars but in lives changed, hope restored, and communities rebuilt one family at a time. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose, Marcus Bennett drove toward Lillian's house with his daughter beside him, knowing he'd never be poor again. Not because of money in a bank account, but because he'd learned what it meant to be rich in the ways that actually mattered. He had purpose. He had family, both blood and chosen. He had a legacy worth protecting. And he had proof that sometimes when you do the right thing, even though it terrifies you, miracles happen. Bernard's holiday haven wasn't just a building anymore. It was a promise kept, a dream realized, a testament to the truth that generosity and courage and love will always triumph over greed and fear. And every child who walked through those doors, every family who received help, every person who learned they weren't alone, was living proof that one man's sacrifice, one father's courage, and one community's determination could indeed change everything. Because in the end, the greatest treasures aren't found in trunks buried beneath floorboards. They're found in the moments we choose to be brave, the times we fight for what's right, and the people who stand beside us when standing requires more strength than we knew we had. Marcus Bennett had found all of that and more. And he'd never stopped being grateful for the day he took a chance on a $12 cabin and discovered that sometimes the smallest investments yield the most extraordinary returns.